privilege to welcome you to the assembly room of the Pennsylvania State House, as this is the actual room where both the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution took place. At the start of the First Continental Congress, which took place during the fall of 1774, the attitudes that were evident throughout the American colonies was still to work things out with the British government. Those delegates who gathered inside of Carpenter's Hall were concerned that some of their rights that they should enjoy being British citizens were being taken away from them. So they put together a list of grievances, and they sent that list to the British government. Unfortunately, those grievances were ignored. And after that, the attitudes throughout the colonies quickly worsened. And about a year after the First Continental Congress, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War would take place. Soon after those shots were fired, delegates from those 13 American colonies would once again come back and meet in this city. But this time they met in this room of the Pennsylvania State House. And even at that time, after the initial start of the war, there were still many differences among those delegates on whether or not to declare independence. You were dealing with a group of individuals with very different backgrounds. Certainly the delegate who was from the colony of Massachusetts, a Puritan, a lawyer, would be quite different in thought or action than the delegate from, let's say, the colony of South Carolina. So even the thought or consideration of independence did not come easy for those delegates. But on June 7, 1776, a gentleman by the name of Richard Henry Lee would stand up on that day and make a very important resolution. He would say that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. 4 days after that resolution, a committee of 5 delegates was formed to write a formal draft declaring independence. Those 5 individuals were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Now, out of those 5 delegates, who was the person chosen to write that initial draft? Yep, you are correct. And Mr. Jefferson would later admit that that draft that he wrote was not one that reflected his own ideas, but one that reflected all of the ideas that were evident in this room at that time. But in order for that draft to be adopted, a number of compromises would have to be made on the actual wording of the Declaration of Independence, on such things as whether or not to refer to the King of England as a tyrant or simply as His Majesty. And when those things were worked out, on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. Now, let me give all of you a quiz, and that is, how many of you think that the actual signing took place on the 4th of July? If you think it did, raise your hand. Perfect group, you're all correct. Because the actual signing did not take place on the 4th of July, but about a month afterwards, on August 2nd. And soon after that signing, those delegates put together our first type of government. Does anyone know what was that called? What document did it come under? The Articles of Confederation. Now, were the Articles successful? No, not in the long run. What was the major problem of the Articles? Okay, weak centralized government. But what were those delegates breaking away from? Probably the strongest national government in the world at that time. So naturally, the logical outgrowth would be they would form a government with a very weak centralized government. Now, the Articles were fine for a period of time, but after the American Revolutionary War ended, there was nothing holding those states together. Those 13 states had become like a snake. Each state, like a snake with 13 different heads. Each state state going in its own different direction. So 11 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, delegates from 12 of the 13 original states would once again come back and meet in this city, in this room, during the summer of 1787. And again, because of those different backgrounds, a number of differences would take place. And probably the most notable one, the one that most ripped that convention apart, centered on whether or not representation in our legislative branch of government should it be based on an equal basis or by population. Well, what do you think the delegates from the smaller states wanted? Equal basis, while the delegates from the larger states felt otherwise. For a period of 5 to 6 weeks, arguments on both sides took place, with the delegates from the small states threatening to walk out. But those delegates were able to come up with a compromise. In fact, it is called the Great Compromise, and it established our two-house legislative branch of government. The Senate representation to be based on an equal basis, and the House of Representatives to be based on by population. So therefore, those delegates were able to settle their differences through compromises to establish a much better meaning for freedom. Was it a perfect meaning? No, it was not a perfect meaning. It did not include everyone. But one of the great attributes of our Constitution is its ability to change in the form of amendments. So therefore, we are continuously, even today, trying to improve upon that meaning of freedom that was established inside of this room. During the course of that convention, a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Franklin, who was 81 years old at the time, and would be sitting right here as close as possible to the doorway. He would often look up during those many heated debates. He would notice in the center of that chair, this very same chair that George Washington was sitting on as he presided over that convention. And he would notice in the center of that chair of a half-carved sun. And he would often wonder, that carved sun, was it a rising sun or a setting sun? What was the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention, knowing full well what those delegates had accomplished? Franklin had the happiness to know that it was indeed a rising sun. And that is how that chair was named, the Rising Sun Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to genuinely thank you for coming on to the tour of Independence Hall. For the next few moments, you're more than welcome to take a look around. If you have any questions, please ask. And when you do decide to leave, you will go out these doors to your left and out the back door. But most of all, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you have a safe and enjoyable visit to Independence National Historic Park. Thank you for coming, and please come back again. Thank you.